Thank you so much. So hi again for everyone who's just kind of jumping on the call. I'm going to go through the agenda, but I'd like to open up by saying that questions are welcome throughout. So because everyone's muted, please just kind of throw your questions in the chat, and I'll definitely pause as we go through so we can make sure we're cementing concepts and answer questions as they come up. And I'll also kind of leave pauses at section breaks so that we can have a bit of a mini discussion before we get to the end, where you also have a chance to ask additional questions. So with that, I'll kind of talk through the agenda quickly. What we're going to cover today is applying process science for business environments. And again, for people jumping on, process science is the proprietary methods and frameworks for process management, process improvement that are developed by my agency, Cavi Consulting. And we apply this universally to businesses of different sizes and scales throughout different industries. Because of the detail level and sort of the fundamentals of process science, it's something that can be applied in that way. So for this presentation, in terms of talking about how we would apply process science for business environments broadly, we're going to spend some time defining universal process management. And in that, we'll take some time to set some operating terminology around basics, such as what is process, because there's so much loaded into that term. We're going to talk about flow, and we're going to frame it in terms of energy flow. And then we're going to define process science more specifically. Once we kind of lay that framework, we're going to go into application. We're going to talk about assessing and managing energy flow, which is the basis of process science. And you're going to see how that kind of plays out in a new project management framework and the methods, but also just the framework in which we assess process maturity in organizations more broadly. We're going to talk through Cavi's flow assessment and just introduce what that might look like to assess maturity in this way. And then we're going to go through our universal methodology to actually execute in business environments with the process science concepts. And then at the end, I'm just going to walk us through some example deliverables so you can get a more tangible sense of how this work manifests itself in different work environments. And then again, we'll summarize and have time for more questions. So in hopping in, let's start with defining universal process management. And again, that always starts with the definition of process. So we'll start with a process definition that the audience is probably more familiar with. And this is something that you could pull from Google, and you can pull from a number of places. You've probably seen this in your other contexts. But it's something that describes the physical steps needed to transform inputs, which could be anything, ideas, raw materials, information, into outputs, goods or services. So at the highest level, you have things going into a process, a transformation occurs, and outputs come out. Now, I introduced this to challenge it. And in terms of challenging it, the question here is, if nobody wants the outputs, will the process continue to exist? So ponder that for a second, because if you have a definition of something and it needs to be qualified, it doesn't really serve the purpose. So there's more to the story here, because the answer that we're talking about is a process shouldn't continue to exist if the outputs aren't desirable, or there's no market, or there's no consumer. So when you think about a process, even if you could say, well, I'm in a business right now where I know all the processes are wasteful and they're still running, that may be true, but it's a moment in time. If you zoom out on the world, processes that don't produce things that people want don't really stay around in the business environment for long. They are on their way out. So if you think about defining process, you can't define it without qualification, because generally, if half the processes out there are not producing any value, and we'll talk about this in this slide, they're not going to exist long. So it actually doesn't define process at all. So in the process science definition of process, a process describes the physical steps needed to transform incoming energy into value. So there's two things that this definition helps tighten up in this regard. Inputs is really focusing on the material side of things, but inputs should be broadened into any source of energy that spurs motion. And we'll talk about that as we go through this definition. But on the outside of that, it has to produce value. And we'll talk about value, but again, value for the customer is mostly what we talk about in the business context, which means that the benefits of what they're receiving outweigh the costs of them receiving it. Value is the difference between benefits and cost. So if you think about value creation is the main driver of processes, If it doesn't produce value, if the outputs are unwanted, the process is going to fade away. So it creates an interesting foundation for us to think about process, because you can assume that if any process is lasting in a business environment, it has to be producing some value by this definition. Otherwise, the process would disappear and it wouldn't exist. So you can't just tie the definition of process to inputs turning into outputs, because if the outputs are not qualified, the process won't be there for you to observe. So this is getting us more into the process science realm of thinking, which is to say that a process has to fall under certain categories of behavior. And it also implies that fundamentally processes have to have certain things in common in terms of transforming energy in a particular way for them to exist in a business environment. So let's talk about some examples of process to root us more into what we're talking about here instead of just an abstract. Common processes I've listed here: preparing breakfast, placing an order, cleaning a room, putting gas in a car. You can see that I chose to use simpler, more personal examples, but if I challenge the audience right now to type in examples of processes, you couldn't type in a wrong answer for the most part. Because in reality, everything is process. Everything in motion can be described by a process. Because if something is moving, there was energy that was put into a system that started that motion. That energy eventually is going to transform or dissipate, and that will end the process, because then the movement will stop. So if you think about, and when I call enabled processes, enabled meaning that energy is put into a process, they can be large, such as a single project process taking 6 months to a year to 2 years to 5 years, or it can be a simple process that's over before you even know it started, like the trillions of chemical processes that are happening in your body on a daily basis. It describes everything. And this is something that you really need to absorb, because a lot of people, I go and when we do consulting work, they say, we don't have a process. A lot of people associate the definition of process with it has to be documented. Something that is a series or a sequence that is known, it's documented, it's standard. That's what people sometimes they refer to sort of casually when they say, oh, we have a process or we don't have a process. It's good to know that there's always process. Process could describe everything that you do and everything that you touch. And when you kind of broaden your definition to that level, process science or process improvement methodologies can be applied the same way to everything. They can be applied to making your breakfast. It can be applied to placing an order or putting gas in your car. It can be applied to massive enterprise projects. It can be applied to operating processes to actually reduce costs and do more traditional process improvement. The point is you have to start having a value-centric thinking of what energy or resources am I putting into an activity, and what is the value that's meant to be derived from it. You don't prepare breakfast just because it's part of your daily routine. Every time you engage in that process, you're getting value out of it. You get sustenance, you get enjoyment. If you're somebody who likes cooking, it could be also entertainment for you. There's a value proposition for all of your energy expenditures. And the study of processes in this way is how you really start to get a mastery in what I like to call a process vision. And then you can start applying process science thinking to everything that you do. So to make it more formal, because we're talking again at kind of a high level about process, in the Cavi methodology, process is described in 3 layers. And these layers are always there simultaneously. A lot of people, again, if you're actually now paying more attention to what your colleagues are saying or what people say when they say the word process, it's a loaded word. Because you can even look up on Google right now the definition of process. You'll get 3 or 4 different definitions. They're all slightly different, but pointing to the same thing. It's actually a real issue in business environments that people say, do you know the process? We're going to work on the process. I want to make a new process. But what does that mean in the physical world? It's a term that can be very ambiguous. And if you don't know what the other person thinks when they're saying process, there's a lot of communication breakdown that happens even at that very level or that start of that conversation. So what we've done here is I've broken the concept of process into 3 layers. So sometimes, I'm going to walk through it in a second, but sometimes people will refer to process as 1 layer. Sometimes they'll refer to it to 2 or 3.